One of the very interesting aspects of church history is to try to trace down the destinations of the apostles after the Bible breaks off in terms of their destinations, their countries that they went to. Thomas, for example, went eastward to India. Thaddeus went up to Edessa. John Mark later went down to Alexandria, Egypt. We know that St. Paul got to Rome. We talked about St. Peter getting to Rome as well last time. What about the other apostles? We're going to see John in Ephesus. That'll come a little bit later. Right now we want to focus on James. Now there are two big Jameses, you recall, in the New Testament. One is John's brother, the son of Zebedee. He unfortunately was beheaded, you recall, in New Testament days, at the same time that St. Peter was put into prison, beheaded by Herod Agrippa I, who was Herod the Great's grandson. I'm talking about the other James, who was the half-brother of Jesus of Nazareth. And as a matter of fact, he was the first bishop of the Christian church in Jerusalem, in fact, the first Christian bishop anywhere. We know that he was in charge of the church because the 15th chapter of the book of Acts tells us that he presided at the Apostolic Council, a very important figure in the early church. He was not a believer in his brother's ministry during his lifetime. It took the resurrection to convince James that his brother was indeed the Christ. And by the way, lest you wonder about this, you know, sometimes people claim, if I were only back in biblical times, I'd have no trouble believing I'd see all this with my own eyes. I'm not sure that's always the case. I like to speak of the scandal of the immediate. If it happens right under your nose, would you believe? I'm not quite sure. How many of you in the audience have older brothers? Okay, just imagine one day that your older brother came home and said, by the way, I haven't told you, but I am the Christ, the Son of God. Immediately you lunge for the yellow pages under P for psychiatrist, right? So I think it's understandable that it's a little difficult for James to believe, and Joseph and Simon and Jude, the other three brothers. But one of the proofs of the resurrection is if your brother, by the way, comes home, dies, and the third day rises again, then forget the telephone directory. I think that would convert you. So in this case, James becomes a heroic believer after the resurrection, a very strategic conversion indeed. And it's kind of fascinating to see whatever happened to James. He's pictured regularly with St. Paul on the various mosaics. Some of the early mosaics usually show Paul with about half his hair to the left and James to the right. James the Just of Jerusalem, fascinating personality. The New Testament does not tell us how he died, but guess who does tell us? Flavius Josephus. In Antiquities, book 20, he says, then James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, was put to death by the Sanhedrin under the direction of one of the sons of Annas, brother-in-law of Caiaphas. His name was Annas. And the Roman governor, who had not yet arrived, his name was Albinus, was so angry when he got to Jerusalem at this lynch mob action, as it were, that he arranged for the high priest to be canned out of office. This is the second time a Roman governor tried to do the right thing by a Jewish religious figure. I call this event Good Friday 2, for reasons that I guess you can ascertain. Eusebius, the father of church history, gives us additional interesting detail on how James was killed. He was thrown off the parapet of the temple, as a matter of fact, and he then was clubbed to death by one of the bystanders. James the Just of Jerusalem died 62 AD, and his death caused the Christians to flee the city of Jerusalem because of the terrible persecution there. And lucky for them that they fled, because the Jewish national revolt against Rome is going to break out 4 years later in 66, and you know how that's going to end, with a tragic, horrendous destruction of Jerusalem. That's why Christians weren't involved in that terrible catastrophe. James's sacrifice, as it were, as another of the great early martyrs of the church, assured their safety. Fascinating to see what happened to the brother of the Lord in that case. And speaking of James, the half-brother of Jesus, in October 2002, an ossuary was discovered with the following inscription: James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. This may indeed be the very James who was the first bishop of the church in Jerusalem and who was martyred by being stoned to death in the year 62 AD, according to both Josephus and Eusebius. Actually, it's possible to start building a, dare we say it, a family tree for Jesus. Now, let me explain this first. Some of you may wonder by now, I speak of James as the half-brother of Jesus. I go on to talk about Joseph, Simon, and Jude. James, you recall, has a book in the New Testament. So does Jude. He's the one who has that second last little short book before you get to the book of Revelation. What about the ever-Virgin Mary? How can these be half-brothers? You must remember that a large sector of Christianity, the Roman Catholic Church, and some High Church Anglicans and High Church Lutherans share in the conviction that Mary was ever-Virgin. Now, this, of course, does raise a problem. We do have the brothers mentioned by name, and we have two sisters, which are unfortunately unnamed. Now, the explanation given in the Roman Catholic Church is that these were either children of Joseph by a previous marriage, or they were, and this is the more popular explanation, they were cousins and friends, relatives. Just as I might this evening say, hello, brothers and sisters in Christ, even though I'm not related to any of you. It's a broader use of that term, and it is true that the term adelphos in Greek often means brother in a wider sense. However, Matthew rather clearly tells us that after Jesus was born, Joseph knew her not maritally until she had borne Jesus. And I think it is probably the most natural interpretation of the text to say that yes, Mary and Joseph lived as a normal husband and wife after the birth of Jesus. I think it would be a little bit unnatural to expect that they would live together as a monk and a nun for the rest of their lives. And I think this in no way detracts from the beauty and sanctity of marriage or Mary itself. It was only about the 5th or 6th century AD that they started worrying about matters sexual and so forth, even those that were permissible. I think it was Jerome who made the statement. He was one of those celibate kinds. He said, whoever is too ardent with his own wife commits adultery, to which we say, boo hiss, buddy. Forget that concept. Yes, it is possible to begin to do a family tree for Jesus. Joseph, on the left, had a brother named Clopas on the right, who probably was one of the two Emmaus disciples. Clopas, in turn, had a son named Simeon, who was the second bishop of the church in Jerusalem. He took over in the year 62 after James, the half-brother of Jesus, was executed. Simeon lived on to a ripe old age and ended his life in crucifixion just as his cousin Jesus did. Now, on the left side, Joseph's sons included Jesus, as was supposed, and also James and Jude. Interestingly enough, Jude had sons and then grandsons, and we do know a little more about the grandsons of Jude. These would be Jesus' grandnephews. Eusebius tells us that there was a later emperor, Domitian, the last of the Flavian emperors, who persecuted the church second time around. And in the process of the persecution, he interviewed those two grandsons. And it's a very interesting passage. Still surviving of the Lord's family were the grandsons of Jude, who was said to be Christ's brother according to the flesh. And they were informed on as being descendants of David. The officer brought them before Domitian Caesar, who, like Herod, was afraid of the coming of Christ. Domitian asked them if they were descended from David, and they admitted it. Then he asked them how much property and money they had. And they replied that they had only 9,000 denarii between them, half belonging to each. And this, they said, was not in the form of cash, but the estimated value of only 39 plethra of land which they owned. That's the equivalent of 20 acres, from which they paid taxes and supported themselves from their own labor. Then, as proof of their toil, they showed the emperor the calluses on their hands and the hardness of their bodies from incessant labor. They were asked about Christ and his kingdom, its nature, origin, and time of appearance. They replied that it was not of this world or earthly, but angelic and heavenly, and that it would be established at the end of the world when he himself would come in glory to judge the living and the dead and reward everyone according to his deeds. At this, Domitian did not condemn them, but despising them as simple sorts, he let them go free and ordered that the persecution against the church cease. After their release, they became leaders of the churches, both for their testimony and because they were of the Lord's family. And they lived on into Trajan's time. Rather interesting little vignette on part of the family tree of Jesus of Nazareth. It's time to talk about how the church governed itself. It's fascinating to see that there is no absolute set form of government that Jesus ordered the church to be governed by. We do have the precedent in the New Testament and also in the pages of Eusebius that the early chief officer of the church was called in Greek the episkopos, which comes from the Greek episkopeo, which means I oversee. I am a shepherd of the flock. I look over the flock. That's the reason that the bishop's staff or crook is the symbol of episcopal office to the present day. Then there are other officers mentioned like presbyters. That's simply the Greek term for elders in the church, who are able to assist the bishops, the episkopoi, in the conduct of their duties. And then there were other churches that were simply house churches and founded themselves on a more of a congregational basis without this officialdom. So while there is no absolutely set form of church government, we do find that bishops do develop in the four chief centers of Christianity in the Mediterranean world, which would be, of course, the city of Jerusalem, where it all began. And even after the destruction of Jerusalem, there are going to be a series of Gentile bishops in charge of the church there later on. So there's always going to be a Christian bishop there. And then in neighboring Egypt and Alexandria, you're certainly going to have a bishop as well. And Egypt is going to be very big in terms of early Christian university training. We'll see that subsequently. Then up in Antioch, where the apostles, you recall, were first called Christians. Don't forget, this is the church which dispatched Barnabas and Saul, later to be called Paul, on the first mission journeys and subsequently. And then finally, there was also the church in Rome, which Paul wanted so badly to visit, and which he did visit at the end of his life, as you well know. Now, the church grew very strongly in those particular four centers. And Eusebius describes for us exactly who was in charge relatively at what time. And it's amusing to see how poor Eusebius is groping for our system of dating. He doesn't have BC AD as we do. Oh no, it goes something like this. After Nerva, that's an emperor, had reigned a little over a year, he was succeeded by Trajan. In his first year, Abilius, after leading the church at Alexandria for 13 years, was succeeded by Serdo, the third in charge of the flock there. And the first was Ananias. At this time, Clement was still head of the Roman church. Similarly, the third in the list of bishops in Rome who followed Paul and Peter, Linus the first, Anancletus the second. Now, this is going to bore anyone to tears reading it like this. You see, if he had only had a master time grid. Believe it or not, our BC AD system of dating did not come along until the 520s AD. Would you believe even after the Roman Empire went completely Christian, they were still using the old AUC dating, ab urbe condita, from the founding of the city. And Rome was founded about 753 years before the birth of Christ. And then to shorten it, they started saying in the 100th year of the accession of the Emperor Diocletian, 284 AD. So 384 would be the 100th year, right? Finally, Bishop John of Rome said, this is ridiculous. Why in the world are we naming our years after a great persecutor of the church? And Diocletian was such a persecutor. So what he did was to find somebody who knew numbers. And he found a fellow named Dionysius Exiguus, Dennis the Little. In the profession, we call him Denny the Dwarf. Anyway, he was good with numbers. And he told him, look, redo the calendar and pivot it about the birth of Christ. And he did the job and screwed up by about 5 years. This is why Jesus himself was born about 5 BC, not in the year 0. There never was a year 0, by the way. You go from 1 BC to 1 AD. So please don't blame Jesus for bad timing, okay? And no bad jokes about a man ahead of his time. Just will not do. In any case, what I did in my translation to Eusebius was to warn the reader, don't go through all this name salad business, but go to Appendix 1 in the back where we have the Roman emperors and the dates listed in one column, and then the bishops of the 4 great churches in the other longitudinal columns. And name me any other institution on earth which has the names of its officers going back 2,000 years. I think that in itself is pretty impressive. And it's just wonderful that we have this kind of documentation on how the church governed itself in those early years, as so faithfully reported by Eusebius. It's interesting to see also that the bishops, including the Bishop of Rome, the office that will later call itself the papacy, the bishops were rather democratically elected. It wasn't any kind of college of cardinals getting together. That's a much later institution. What happened was you got all the bishops in a given province or in a given area or country, and they would get together in what's called a synod. That means to walk together, a synod of bishops, and they then would elect the chief bishop in Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, or Rome. And there's a wonderful story I have to tell you about how one of the bishops of Rome got elected. There was a synod that was taking place in the death of the previous bishop. And there were front-runner political candidates, of course. Sitting in the back of the room without any chance or any aspirations ever to make it to the top was a bishop from southern Italy named Fabian. However, Fabian was sitting next to an open window. And in the course of the conclave, a dove flew in the open window and landed on his head. And that was it. Obviously, the Holy Spirit had spoken. That was the end of the conclave. Axios, Axios, they said, he's worthy, he's worthy. And he was then elected as the Bishop of Rome. And by the way, he did a good job. Maybe the Holy Spirit had spoken indeed. Pretty fascinating material there. One of the great tragedies, of course, in all of Jewish history was the fact that they should have listened to Josephus and not raised the standard of rebellion against Rome. Because when they blew the lid in AD 66 and the horrible Jewish war took place against Rome. It was a catastrophe for the city of Jerusalem. The Romans, under the Flavian emperors, there are famous ones, of course. Vespasian was the conqueror of much of Galilee. He was aiming for Jerusalem when he was called to be emperor of Rome. And so he left the siege of Jerusalem in the very capable hands of his son Titus, who then succeeded him in terms of both generalship and in terms of also the imperial purple. Titus was the one who then supervised the siege of Jerusalem, in which there was a horrible famine, in which people were starving, and in the most horrible act of cannibalism probably in history, some poor Jewish woman sacrificed her own baby and ate half of it in order to stay alive. This is exactly what Jesus predicted on the way to his cross at Golgotha, you recall. He says, "Women of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for what is going to happen to you people in a short time." And so the destruction of Jerusalem then meant a separation, really, of the Jewish Christians and the Christians, and certainly a separation between the Jews and the Gentiles from that point on. And Jewish Christianity had a very tough time and didn't really last that much longer. And in fact, I hate to tell you, but there's a good deal of hostility that now breaks out between church and synagogue. On the part of the Jews, you have them accusing Christians and causing some persecutions of the early Christians. And from the Christian side, you also have anti-Semitism in terms of Eusebius's feeling that the reason that Jerusalem was destroyed was God's wrath because the Jews had crucified his son Jesus Christ. And we don't quite say that today, not only because it's not politically correct, but because there's some questionable theology there. So it's kind of tragic that it was an intolerant era, and we are going to find trouble between Jews and Christians. We're also going to find trouble in the second great Roman persecution, which took place under Titus's brother, son of Vespasian, whose name was Domitian. Titus, of course, had celebrated his triumph in Rome after destroying Jerusalem in the famous Arch of Titus, which stands to this day at the eastern end of the Roman Forum. And inside, under the arch, you can see the famous showbread of the temple and the trumpeters celebrating their victory over the Jews and the city of Jerusalem. Domitian himself was unfortunately the fellow in whom the virtue of the Flavians died out. He becomes a persecutor of the church. And indeed, he visited all kinds of problems on the early Christians. He himself put to death his own first cousin, Flavius Clemens, for being a Christian, and he banished his wife, Domitilla, to an island in the Mediterranean. Now, this is fascinating. It shows that Christianity is rising in the social ladders in Rome. So often we get the idea that Christianity was the religion only of the commoners, the laborers, the slaves, and so on. Oh, no. Even Paul talks about people in Caesar's household who are Christians. And now we have here the imperial family itself, some members of which are turning Christians. And we can prove that because, fascinatingly, there is a catacomb south of Rome called the catacombs of Domitilla. They are named for Flavius Clemens' wife, the granddaughter of Vespasian, who willed her territory, some acreage that she owned south of Rome, to the Christian church. And the catacombs have to this day on the third line Vespasian's name and the fourth line Domitilla's name in the catacombs of Domitilla. We will continue next time and talk about the defenders and defamers of the church.